It was just another ordinary Tuesday at school. The bell had rung, signaling the start of our third period class, and everyone was chatting away as usual. I was in the middle of math when the announcement came over the intercom. The voice, calm but urgent, told us to immediately lock the doors and stay away from the windows. No one knew why, but it didn't take long for the panic to set in. The banging on our classroom door was the first sign that something was wrong. It was loud, forceful, like someone was trying to break through. Then we heard him, the man, screaming something incomprehensible. He was shouting at the teacher, demanding to be let in. Our teacher, Mrs. Thomas, was frantic. She quickly bolted the door and turned off the lights, but the man outside didn't stop. Suddenly there was a gunshot, loud, deafening, and sharp. He had shot through the door. We all froze, holding our breath as the man's footsteps grew closer. He banged on the door again, this time with a fury that rattled the walls. Then it went silent. For a few terrifying seconds, all we could hear was our own breath, shaky and tense. Without warning, the door exploded open. The man stormed into the room, his gun pointed straight ahead. He was shouting, his face twisted in anger. Mrs. Thomas tried to shield herself, but it was no use. He grabbed her by the arm, yelling at her to get up. He hit her across the face, hard, and dragged her out of the room by her hair. The last thing I heard before the door slammed shut was her screaming for help. We huddled in the corner, too scared to move, barely able to process what had just happened. Outside, we could hear more yelling, the sickening sound of gunshots, and then silence. I don't know how long we sat there, waiting, too terrified to even breathe. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. Then the cops came. They cleared our classrooms one by one, telling us not to move. They told us everything was going to be okay, but it didn't feel that way. I don't think any of us truly believed it until we were out of the building. In the end, the man was arrested, but we never found out what happened to Mrs. Thomas. We all knew that we were lucky to have made it out alive. But some of us, myself included, still hear the sound of those gunshots in our heads every time we close our eyes. Number 2, it started like any other sports class. We were out on the field playing our usual game of soccer when a man suddenly appeared at the edge of the field. At first, he didn't seem like much, a regular guy, maybe a little out of place, but nothing that would make us think twice. But then he started walking toward us, his eyes darting from person to person. He looked panicked, almost desperate. I noticed his hands were shaking, and in one of them he was gripping a knife. Our teacher, Coach Harris, stepped forward to try and talk to him. But the man didn't respond to his words. He just kept eyeing us, focusing on one of the girls in our class, Emily. She was standing near the goalpost, laughing with her friends, unaware of what was happening. Without warning, the man lunged at Emily, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her toward him. She screamed, but the man just kept pulling, dragging her away from the field. Everything happened so quickly. One of the boys, Tyler, tried to stop him, but the man swiped at him with the knife, missing by inches. Coach Harris shouted for everyone to get inside the school, but it was too late. The man was already heading toward the fence with Emily in tow. It wasn't until the sound of sirens echoed in the distance that the man stopped. He looked around, realizing he'd been spotted. The moment he hesitated, Emily kicked him in the shin, and that's when Coach Harris managed to tackle him. The police arrived moments later, and the man was taken away. Emily was shaken but unharmed, thanks to Coach Harris. But I couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come to being taken, how everything had turned so quickly into a nightmare. I'll never forget the look in her eyes as she realized she had narrowly escaped. Number 3, as a teacher, you always expect the unexpected. But nothing could have prepared me for that day. It was just another quiet Monday morning. The bell rang and students began filing into my classroom. I noticed a new face among them, a young man, probably in his early 30s, with a nervous smile and a stack of papers in his hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Clark, a substitute teacher who had been sent to cover my class. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was running late to a meeting, so I handed over the lesson plans and asked him to keep things moving while I was gone. I was barely a few steps out of the door when I heard a commotion. One of my students, Kelly, came running to me in the hallway, her face pale. "He's not a teacher," she whispered urgently. I froze. "What do you mean he's not a teacher?" Kelly's eyes were wide with fear. He doesn't know anything about the lesson, and he was acting weird. He he kept staring at me and asking if I wanted to go out for coffee after school. Panic surged through me. I rushed back to the classroom and called for the office. But when I opened the door, Mr. Clark was nowhere to be found. The students were sitting quietly at their desks, looking confused. I immediately locked the door and instructed everyone to stay put. It was then that I noticed something even more unsettling. Mr. Clark's stack of papers wasn't lesson plans, it was just random notes and scribbles. The office confirmed they had no record of a Mr. Clark as a substitute for my class. We immediately went into lockdown mode. I could hear someone pacing in the hallway, muttering to himself. By the time the authorities arrived, Mr. Clark had disappeared. They found nothing in the school that suggested he had entered the building through proper channels. The police said he had likely been impersonating a teacher, but they never found him. Now, every time a substitute comes into my classroom, I double-check the credentials, because there's no way to know who might be walking through that door.